Welcome to the tutorial on how to set up your lab notebook. By now you should have received your lab notebook. So without further ado, let's get started. The first page you'll notice when you open your book is your table of contents. This is a good way to keep track of which lab is where. Also, if you happen to lose your lab notebook, make sure that you put in at least your name, so if the office gets it, they can at least return it to you. Otherwise, if you don't end up being able to get it back, it's going to cost you another $10. So this is what the page actually looks like in the lab notebook. You'll notice that it has an area to fill out on top with just general information. And then we have just a grid style. It doesn't matter whether you write all the way across it, or if you decide you want to write down and then have two columns of information. The bottom I don't really typically use a whole lot, which is just dealing with a signature or a date. I may use it as a checkoff spot, but other than that, you don't have to worry about it too much. So this is what the top looks like. So the first thing that you're going to want to do anytime you have a lab is fill out your lab information. It's up to you how you want to number your experiments, but typically we just call the first one 1, and then we'll put a title. Well, for your first lab, since we're preparing for that, the experiment is called Mass and Change. The date is the date that you start the lab on. Now sometimes we'll have 2-day labs, so you always want to put the first date. So you're going to be starting this lab tomorrow, so you're going to put tomorrow's date in it. And then put your name. And then finally your lab partner. Typically you only have one lab partner, but on occasion you might have two. Just kind of squeeze their names in there. You don't need to worry about the locker desk number. You can just leave that blank. But I would appreciate if you would be able to put your section number in there. If you're in chemistry, first section, just put chemistry 1. Or if you're in honors chemistry 1, you just put honors 1. You'll want to do all of this in black pen. Why black? Well, blue runs. So if you happen to spill some water on it, blue ink tends to run. You also want to avoid any kind of gel pen as they also run. Pencil is not acceptable. You needed some kind of permanent writing material. Here are the sections that a completed lab will contain. First is the objective, then the hypothesis, a pre-lab, procedure, data observations and calculations, group results if we accumulated group results, and then finally a conclusion. Now it may seem like a lot, but realistically the first 4 should be done before you even get into the lab. You write down all of the stuff for the data observations, and the calculations probably can get done in class, and the group results you'll get from class. So really about the only thing that you actually have to take home or maybe do outside of class is your conclusion. So let's start with the first one, the objective. Basically the objective is just, why are you doing the lab? What purpose is it serving? So what are you hoping to find? Is it a single answer, or is it a relationship between variables? Be kind of specific when it comes to that. We're doing mass and change for our first lab. If you take a look, you should have already received your lab mass and change work sheet for your pre-lab. And if you take a look at it, I'll give you a hint. You should be able to find the objective pretty well stated in the second paragraph. So I just took an example of maybe another lab, and I just basically said the purpose of this lab is to determine the identity of an unknown metal. That's just an example of how it could be written. Like I said, the Mass and Change lab, the second paragraph would be a good place to kind of look and get an idea for what the objective is if the title of the lab wasn't a dead giveaway. The second one is the hypothesis. This is basically a prediction about what you expect to happen. Don't be afraid to be wrong. Make a guess. Part of the learning process is actually bringing out your ideas, whether they be right or wrong. So oftentimes you'll be wrong, and it's okay. A hypothesis is what it is. It's a hypothesis. So even if you are incorrect, but as long as you made a hypothesis, you'll get what you need. For an example, it is predicted that a person's arm span and height are proportional. Okay, so if you notice, it gives you all the information that you need about what's going on in the lab and what your prediction actually is. Another example is it's predicted that the density of the metal is greater than about 5 grams per milliliter. The next section is the pre-lab. Basically, the pre-lab is questions about previous knowledge. Oftentimes, we need to activate our previous knowledge so that we can utilize it in current events. It's also information that you might need in order to complete the lab. On your lab mass and change sheet, you'll notice that there's a section that says pre-lab questions. These are the questions that you're going to answer in this section. The next one is probably the toughest. This is going to be your procedure. So the procedure should be written in your own words by watching the pre-lab videos. You should be writing it in a step-by-step fashion. So step 1, what happened? Step 2, what happened? Make sure that you also include any equipment used. It's going to be awfully tough to come to lab without writing down, well, did she use a beaker or did she use a test tube? Also, it must include room to add measurements. Any kind of measurements that you're using or you're doing along the way need to be added into your procedure. So if I mass something, say a beaker, you need to leave a little spot to put in what your mass of that beaker is. Also, it's always a good idea to leave a little bit of extra space in case you need to add something that you forgot. Data observations and calculations. I used to have this as 2 sections, but I decided it made more sense if everything was mashed together. The biggest reason is because data should always be organized into into charts or data tables. So basically there's 3 things that are going to be required to complete the lab. Your data, which is your quantitative information. You should organize it into tables, and then if you need to use graphical representations such as graphs, that can be added as well. Your observations are your qualitative information. Make sure you make lots of observations. Sometimes observations are important, sometimes they're not. But it's always easier to just omit something and not use it for your conclusion than to not have made the observation and now you're not able to go back. Calculations, some of the calculations are pretty simple and straightforward. Some of them get pretty complex. Make sure that you show all your steps for anything that's super complex. It's going to be a lot easier for the reader to follow, and it's also going to be easier for you to follow if you ever need to go back. For many labs, we're going to have group results. This is a good place to add notes on other group findings, record averages, and any kind of statistical analysis that we're going to do. It's going to vary based on the lab. Not all of our labs do we have group results, but there are a fair number. If we're not doing a group results write-up or discussion section, then you can just omit this section altogether. Finally, the last one is your conclusion. The conclusion can get kind of tough. We're going to walk through the first couple of them and help you along. But basically, a conclusion is a summary of the lab findings. First off, it should include a statement about your findings. What did you find? Was arm span proportional to the height of the person? Or was it not? And then you should include any kind of supportive statements for the findings. So what did you find out? Well, maybe you use your group results. Maybe everybody in the class saw that there was this trend when we graphed the data where it showed that there was a proportionality between them. You should also include an error analysis, and make sure your error analysis is specific to your results. Meaning, so let's say you're trying to find the density of a particular metal, and let's say your density was lower than what it should have been. Your error should lead the value to be lower than the density. So you can't just put all errors down. Some of them will cause the density to actually be higher than what it should be. So you want to be very specific to what your results say. All right, so let's start to fill out what it's gonna start to look like. So for the first thing, we'll start on the table of contents. Like I said, fill out your name. Make sure that you have it in there so at least it can get returned to you. Then under date, you're going to put the date that you start the lab, and I'm just going to leave it generic right now. Then write the name of your experiment. And then what page number the lab starts on. Okay? Notice I say starts on. If you have to skip pages, you can always write on the bottom of the page, continued on page, blah, blah, blah. So this one is going to be your first one, so we're going to start on page 1. That's really all there is to filling out your table of contents. If you forget to fill it out right away, you can always come back to it and fill it out the next day, but it is always a good idea to kind of keep up on it. All right, so in a previous slide, we already filled out all this information up here. So this is all filled in. So I want to get you started on the top part. You should use headers when you're writing your lab report. So the first thing is we're going to do an objective. Like I said, the objective can be found on your lab mass and change if you just read some of the background information. So go ahead and fill in your objective. It's usually one statement, maybe 2 statements, and that's about it. The next thing is going to be your hypothesis. Now this is kind of a unique lab in that there's 6 parts to it. If you have a separate guess for every part, you're going to need to make 6 hypotheses. If you think the same thing's going to happen in all of them, well then you can just make one and say, this is going to happen in all situations. It's completely up to you. But you should address the 6 different parts. So for this one, you might not be able to make your hypothesis yet since you haven't actually watched the next video for the procedure. So you may need to come back to this after you watch what I'm doing in the lab and write your procedure. But remember that you're going to want 1 for each. Make sure you address each part of the lab. There are 6 parts to this lab. So the next part is going to be your pre-lab. You can answer the questions that are provided to you. So on your lab mass and change sheet, you'll notice towards the bottom it says pre-lab questions. They're just 3 questions. There usually won't be too many of them. It might require you to graph. It might require you to look up some information. If you do have to look up some information, just leave a little citation on the side to say where you got that information. If you got it from the internet, just leave the website. If you got it from your textbook, leave a page number. So this is basically how you'll get started. The next section will end up being your procedure. Once again, you'll use a header that'll say procedure. and then you'll just continue to write your procedure. Remember to use a step-by-step format for your procedure, and then you'll just continue on from there. So I hope this helped you get started on filling in your lab notebook. If you have any questions, make sure you feel free to ask.